As D&D turns 50, is the game finally showing its age? Or is the brand finally what Gary Gygax always wanted it to be?
That don't make no sense!
Last week, I was reading the Dungeons & Dragons Saturday Morning Adventures comic book, a continuation of the 1980s cartoon series. In it, the group of teen adventurers flirted with Drizzt, hopped on their Spelljammer, and then traveled down the Sword Coast to meet another Forgotten Realms character. It was a timely reminder of what Dungeons & Dragons is and isn't, as it passed its unofficial 50th birthday last weekend. Now, in a lot of ways, Dungeons & Dragons has never been bigger. It got a movie last year, a good movie. It was featured in the Video Game of the Year. More people play Dungeons & Dragons now than ever before. It has comics and action figures and plushies and t-shirts and books and designer dice and jewelry and all the stuff that Gary Gygax dreamed of when he was trying to peddle Dungeons & Dragons as a brand to Hollywood types in the 1980s, which is how we got that D&D cartoon in the first place. But despite all of that, it often feels like Dungeons & Dragons is lacking any sort of momentum as it enters what, for all intents and purposes, should be a golden celebration year. Now, part of that is simply perception. If you watch this YouTube channel, you're probably someone who follows tabletop RPG news, and a lot of the news surrounding D&D and its parent company Hasbro has been less than great. The D&D movie, it wasn't profitable. It was well received, but it wasn't profitable. Wizards of the Coast has been mired in a series of controversies ranging from inconsequential to industry-threatening. And Hasbro still had the gall to cut staff in its most profitable division, despite the fact that Wizards of the Coast was holding up the entire company. But part of it is also the culmination of what Dungeons & Dragons has been growing to for these last 50 years. It doesn't really need momentum. It simply needs to exist in perpetuity, a brand that is approaching some level of mainstream recognition to the point that it doesn't need momentum. Now, last month, Ben Riggs declared that the golden age of tabletop RPGs was dead, but what he meant was that the golden age of 5e was dead. And what he really meant was that the golden age of 5e dominating in a very specific niche of the tabletop space was dead. And that's probably true, because 5e's hold on the tabletop RPG market, and more specifically, the more invested tabletop RPG player market, might be waning, because there are so many other good games out there, and so many other good games about to come out. We could be entering a new golden age of fantasy RPGs, given that Daggerheart and MCDM and Stormlight are all coming out in the next couple of years, and Pathfinder and Tales of the Valiant, those are coming out this year, or will continue to be coming out this year. But Dungeons & Dragons doesn't need a golden age, because it's almost evolved past that point. Sure, the discerning tabletop RPG player might be excited to play one of those other games, but Dungeons & Dragons has an entire section at the game store. It has an entire section at Barnes & Nobles. It has an entire bookshelf at Target. It has the novels, it has the stuff, it has the video games, and it will continue to have all of that because the Dungeons & Dragons brand means something now. I don't know what it means, and frankly, I don't think Hasbro does either. But it means something, and that something sells stuff. The reality is that for hundreds of thousands of people, Dungeons & Dragons will be their first RPG, and for hundreds of thousands of more people, Dungeons & Dragons will be the only tabletop RPG that they've ever heard of, even if they don't play it. And while I'm sure the folks who make Dungeons & Dragons and who sell Dungeons & Dragons would love for D&D to be talked about in the same vein as Bison or Into the Odd or that big black box that Monty Cook sells for $500, the reality is it doesn't really need that. It doesn't need us, the hardcore tabletop RPG player, to be excited about the game. It would like us to. Hasbro would love for us to be excited about D&D, but it doesn't need us to. Now, I don't know how much the 2024 core rulebooks are going to sell at game stores. I know that there are a lot of folks who are less than enthused by the direction that Wizards is taking the 2024 core rulebooks, and there are probably some bean counters within Hasbro who thought that D&D could have sold more of those core rulebooks if it was a new edition instead of a revised one. Although, I could be wrong about that because Hasbro is a big company that employs a lot of bean counters, and I'm sure they've done the math. But Regardless of how excited I am about those core rulebooks, or how excited you are about those new core rulebooks, those books are still going to sell on Amazon. They're still going to sell at Target. They're still going to sell at Barnes & Nobles. It's probably even going to sell at the indie bookstore. And it's going to sell on D&D Beyond, especially on D&D Beyond. And Hasbro will probably make more money off of those core rulebooks than probably the next 3 publishers will on their top-selling books of the year combined. Because for every hardcore gamer who's not interested in those core rulebooks, who feel that D&D doesn't do enough, or that these core rulebooks are just extending the problem that is 5e, there's 3 people who will pass by the shiny box set at a store that maybe has 1 or 2 other tabletop RPGs on the shelf somewhere and probably pick it up because it will be the first core rulebook for any tabletop RPG that they ever buy. And that's really the power of the D&D brand. Now, what will be more interesting is how the Dungeons & Dragons brand will continue to evolve over the next few years. It's a little bit interesting, kind of curious, that we haven't heard a peep about that D&D TV show ever since the movie didn't live up to Hasbro's expectations. But in the past 3 months, we've gotten 2 new D&D video game announcements. D&D Beyond. It's never been bigger for D&D's future. And then there's that VTT too. Who knows how that's going to do? And we're also getting more D&D novels again, beyond, the Dritz books for the first time in like a hot minute. And yes, we will almost certainly be getting some kind of big D&D anniversary celebration, probably at Gen Con. I think as we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, it's important to remember what it is and what it isn't. The game, 5e, is in more of a precarious position compared to some of its peers, and that's probably what this channel will focus on more than ever. Because it's really interesting how 5e is looked at by us, the hardcore tabletop RPG player. But at the same time, the D&D brand, it's bigger now than it ever was before, to the point that the game, it's only one piece of the puzzle. A big piece, but a piece nonetheless. Now, if you excuse me, I have like 3 more D&D comics that I apparently need to read. Can't wait to find what happens out to those kids. Maybe they die this time around, or maybe they don't. We'll see. Anyways, happy birthday to D&D. Let us know what your thoughts are in the comment section, and don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.